Imagine the darkest part of the night. Not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom, not the soft quiet of a house at rest. This is a different kind of dark. Cold, foreign, hostile. The kind of dark that breathes. Somewhere in the forests north of the Rhine, or deep in the mountains of Dacia, or across the grey marshes of Britannia, a Roman army has stopped moving. The long column that had stretched for miles across the land has folded itself into a rectangle of earth and timber. Fires burn low inside. 8,000 men lie pressed together in small leather tents, shoulder to shoulder, breathing each other's warmth. The smell of wet wool, sweat and smoke hangs over everything like fog. And somewhere out there, just beyond the ditch and the palisade wall, the enemy is awake. They are watching the camp, waiting. Perhaps they have been waiting for 3 nights now, searching for a gap, a moment of weakness, a careless sentry who let his eyes close for just a second too long. But the sentries do not sleep. They cannot sleep. Because in the Roman army, falling asleep on watch was not a mistake you apologized for in the morning. It was a crime your own fellow soldiers executed you for before sunrise. This video is about something that almost no one talks about when they discuss the Roman legions. It is not about the gladius, or the formations, or the famous roads. It is about the night. About what happened after the march ended and before the next battle began. About how the most disciplined army in the ancient world managed the hours of darkness in enemy territory, night after night, for months on end, across thousands of miles of hostile land. And here is the thing that will surprise you before this video is over. The Roman army did not win its empire only on the battlefield. It won it in the dark, with a leather tent, a hand-dug ditch, and a system so precise and so relentless that it turned tired, ordinary men into something their enemies genuinely feared, not just in daylight, but especially at night. If you enjoy history told clearly, without the dry textbook feeling, subscribe so you do not have to search for this channel again. There is a lot more coming. Before we enter the main story, I want to ask you something simple. Comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I am genuinely curious, and I will try to reply to as many comments as I can. And now, get ready to enter the main story. To understand how Roman soldiers slept on campaign, you first have to understand what campaign actually meant for a Roman legionary. This was not a weekend exercise. This was not a short deployment to a nearby province. For hundreds of years, Rome was almost constantly at war. Not just one war, but overlapping conflicts across multiple frontiers, separated by thousands of miles of road, sea and wilderness. Gaul to the northwest, Germania beyond the Rhine, Dacia across the Danube, Parthia and then Persia to the east, Britannia on the edge of the known world, North Africa, from the deserts of Egypt to the Atlantic shore of what is now Morocco. The Roman Empire at its height covered roughly 5 million square kilometers, and every single inch of that territory had been taken, held or contested by Roman soldiers who needed to eat, sleep and stay alive far from home. The scale of this is worth sitting with for a moment. A legion marching from Rome to the Rhine frontier traveled over 1,500 kilometers. A campaign in Dacia under the Emperor Trajan lasted years, not weeks. The men who fought for Rome did not commute to a battlefield and come home for dinner. They lived on the road, in enemy territory, in every season and every kind of weather, for years at a time. And every single night they built a fort, not a permanent fort, not a stone wall with towers and a garrison, a temporary one, made of earth and timber and muscle and discipline, constructed in 3 to 6 hours at the end of a day in which those same men had already marched between 20 and 30 kilometers with 40 kilograms of equipment on their backs. Then, in the morning, they tore it apart packed everything onto their mules, and started marching again. This happened every night, in rain, in snow, in the baking heat of the Syrian summer. After battles, after forced marches that pushed men to the edge of what a human body can endure. This is the system we are going to explore. But before we look at the details, we need to understand why it existed in the first place. And to do that, we need to go back to a single man and a single decision that changed everything. His name was Gaius Marius. Marius did not invent the Roman camp. The practice of fortifying overnight positions had existed in Roman military culture for generations, though its exact origins are debated by historians, and the earliest well-documented accounts come from Polybius, writing in the 2nd century before the Common Era. What Marius did was something more radical. He looked at the Roman army of his time and saw a machine that was slowing itself down. The problem was baggage. Roman armies of the earlier Republic travelled with enormous wagon trains. Carts carrying grain, tents, tools and supplies stretched for miles behind the fighting units. These wagons needed roads. They bogged down in mud. They broke down on mountain passes. They created a long, vulnerable tail that enemies could raid, and that made the army sluggish and predictable. A Roman army moving with its full baggage train was not fast. It was, in the worst cases, a magnificent target. Marius looked at the wagon train and said, in effect, "Get rid of it." He gave each soldier more equipment to carry personally and reorganized the logistics so that the heavy burden fell on the men themselves, or on mules assigned to each small unit, rather than on a slow and vulnerable convoy of carts. The men who went through this transformation complained bitterly, as soldiers always do when asked to carry more. They called themselves Marius's mules. The nickname stuck, and in time it became something almost like a badge of honor. But the real consequence of what Marius did went much deeper than logistics. By cutting the wagon train, he also changed the nature of the Roman camp. When the baggage traveled separately and arrived late, or not at all, the camp had to function without it. When the men carried their own tents, their own tools, their own food, the camp could be built anywhere, at any time, by the men themselves. It became self-contained, portable, repeatable. And that repeatability was the key. Because here is what most people forget when they study ancient warfare. The enemy was also out there at night. Every night that a Roman army spent in enemy territory was a night that hostile forces could attack, raid, probe the perimeter, try to cut off foragers, ambush water-gathering parties, or simply keep the Romans from sleeping well enough to fight the next day. Sleep deprivation is a weapon that does not require a sword. It kills armies slowly, from the inside, through exhaustion, poor decisions, and soldiers too tired to hold formation when the fighting starts. The Romans understood this. Their enemies understood it too. What made the difference was not courage. The Gauls were brave. The Germans were fierce. The Dacians were skilled and determined. What made the difference was that when a Roman army stopped moving for the night, it did not simply stop, it transformed. It became something else. A camp that looked temporary from a distance was, in practice, a fortified position that would take a serious military operation to breach. An enemy looking at a Roman marching camp was not looking at men in sleeping bags on an open field. They were looking at a ditch, a wall, a palisade of sharpened stakes, guarded gates, and organized sentries who changed on a four-watch system through the night. The ancient historian Polybius, who travelled with Roman armies and recorded their methods in extraordinary detail, noted something that still stands out when you read his account today. He observed that the Greeks, when choosing where to camp, looked for natural terrain features to protect them. Hills, rivers, dense forest. They used the land as their defence. The Romans looked at the land and said, "That is not good enough," and then they dug. Polybius was not a Roman himself. He was a Greek who had been taken to Rome as a hostage and ended up becoming one of the most important historians of the ancient world. His view of the Roman camp was the view of an outsider who recognized with genuine admiration that what he was seeing was something new in the history of warfare. No army before the Romans had built fortified camps as a routine, nightly, non-negotiable part of military operations. Not the Persians, not the Macedonians, not Alexander the Great, whose armies were extraordinary in every other way. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge what historians can and cannot tell us with certainty. Polybius wrote about the Roman camp of the Republican period, roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era. Later writers like Vegetius and Hyginus described camps from the imperial period, which was different in some ways. The exact measurements of tents, the precise number of men per unit in practice versus on paper, and the specific routines of any given night are subjects where ancient sources sometimes disagree and where modern scholars continue to debate the details. What is clear, beyond any serious doubt, is that the system existed, that it was widespread, that it was enforced with serious discipline, and that it worked. And one of the clearest pieces of evidence that it worked is this. When you look at the map of the Roman Empire, you are not just looking at the extent of Roman conquest. You are looking at a network of campsites. Many of the cities of modern Europe, the ones with names ending in Chester or Castor in England, or with roots in words like Colonia and Castra in France and Germany and Romania, began as Roman marching camps or permanent fortresses. York in England was a Roman fortress. Cologne in Germany was a Roman colony and military base. Vienna in Austria began as the camp of Vindobona. The overnight positions of Roman armies became the foundations of cities that are still inhabited 2,000 years later. The system was not just effective, it was generative. It created the physical infrastructure of a civilization. This is the same lesson that strong organizations teach even today. Discipline looks boring until chaos begins. The Romans were boring about their camps in the best possible way. Every night, the same layout, the same routine, the same rules, and every night 5,000 men, who should have been too tired to stand up straight, instead built a small fortress and slept inside it. That is where our story really begins. To understand what the Roman night actually looked like, you have to start with the morning, because the night was built in the morning. Its foundations were laid before the first step of the day's march, in the choices made by officers who knew that every decision about pace, route, and timing would determine whether their men had enough daylight left to build a defensible camp before darkness fell. The Roman day on campaign began early, well before sunrise, in most cases. The order to break camp came from the command tent, carried through the ranks by trumpet signals whose specific calls every soldier had learned to recognize. The men did not wander out of their tents, look at the sky, and decide how they felt about the day. They rose, rolled their cloaks, gathered their gear, and began the process of dismantling the camp. Tents were folded. Stakes were pulled from the ground. The leather folds of each tent were compressed and tied, then loaded onto the mule assigned to each 8-man group. Anything that could be used by an enemy was either carried out or destroyed. What had taken 3 to 6 hours to build the previous evening was taken apart in less time than that. Then the march began. A Roman legionary on campaign carried a load that modern military researchers estimate at somewhere between 20 and 40 kilograms, depending on the source and the period. Ancient accounts suggest that Marius pushed his soldiers to carry more than earlier standards required, but the exact figure is one that historians still debate, partly because equipment varied by unit type and era. What no one debates is that it was heavy. A soldier carried his weapons, including his pilum javelins and his short sword, the gladius. He carried his shield, the large curved scutum, in a protective cover. He carried sections of the palisade stakes that would become part of tonight's camp wall. He carried rations for several days. He carried his portion of the tent, tools for digging, and personal items. All of this was balanced on a forked pole that sat across one shoulder, a design that distributed the weight and left the hands free to manage the march. The average pace on a normal campaign day was somewhere between 22 and 30 kilometers. That is the range given by ancient sources and confirmed by modern analysis of Roman road networks and campaign records. On forced marches, when speed was critical, Roman armies pushed significantly harder. Ancient accounts, including those of Julius Caesar, describe marches of 45 to 60 kilometers in a single day. Though Caesar himself treats these as exceptional and exhausting feats rather than routine expectations, what matters for our purposes is the normal day. 25 kilometers of walking, in armor, carrying 40 kilograms, on whatever road or path the route required. By mid-afternoon, sometimes earlier in difficult terrain, the advance party was already at work. The advance party was a group of tribunes and centurions, usually mounted, who rode ahead of the main column to select and mark the campsite for the night. This was not a casual task. The criteria were specific and non-negotiable. The ground needed to be defensible, ideally slightly elevated so that the camp could observe the surrounding area. It needed access to water, because 5,000 men and their animals required large quantities every single day. It could not be overlooked by higher ground nearby that an enemy could use to throw missiles into the camp or observe its interior. And it had to be large enough for the full layout of the camp, which followed a standardized plan that never changed, regardless of where in the empire the army happened to be. This last point is the one that deserves the most attention, because it is the heart of the whole system. The Roman marching camp had a fixed layout, not a suggested layout, not a flexible template that officers could adapt based on personal preference, a fixed layout. The commander's tent, called the praetorium, always occupied the same central position. The main street of the camp, the Via Principalis, always ran in the same direction relative to the commander's position. Each cohort, each century, each contubernium of 8 men always set up in the same position relative to everything else. A soldier who had served in one legion and been transferred to another could walk into an unfamiliar camp in total darkness and find his assigned tent position without asking a single question, because the layout was identical everywhere. Once the advance party had selected the site, they marked it out with flags of different colors. When the main column arrived, there was no confusion about where to go or what to do. Each unit moved to its marked position, and construction began immediately. Construction meant digging first. The outer boundary of the camp was defined by a ditch. In a full marching camp, this ditch was typically around 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, though dimensions varied by period and circumstances, and the exact specifications are subjects where ancient sources give somewhat different figures. The earth from the ditch was thrown inward and compressed into a rampart, a raised bank that ran along the inside edge of the ditch and gave defenders height advantage over anyone trying to cross from outside. On top of this rampart, each soldier planted his palisade stakes. These were not random pieces of wood. They were purpose-cut, shaped to be sharpened at both ends, and designed to interlock with each other when planted in sequence, creating a fence that was difficult to grab, climb, or cut through quickly. 4 gates broke the perimeter, one on each side, each positioned and constructed to allow rapid deployment in any direction while still being defensible against attack. Guard towers or raised platforms flanked the gates. The entire construction, from arriving at the site to driving the last stake into the palisade, took between 3 and 6 hours, depending on the size of the force, the quality of the ground, and whether the army was under immediate threat. Think about what that means in physical terms. These men had already marched 25 kilometers with 40 kilograms on their backs. They arrived at the campsite tired, sweating through their tunics, feet blistered, shoulders aching from the weight of the pole. And then they dug. Not a shallow trench. A proper defensive ditch, 2 meters deep, 3 meters wide, running the full perimeter of the camp. Then they built a wall, then they planted a fence, then they organized the interior. The Roman historian Livy tells a story that captures the discipline behind this system better than any description of tent dimensions or ditch measurements. A Roman army was in the process of building its camp when a junior officer arrived at a gallop to report that the enemy was nearby and in a perfect position to be attacked. "Strike now!" the officer urged, and victory was certain. The senior commanders exchanged glances. Some moved as if to give the order to suspend construction. The consul stopped them. He did not say that the attack was a bad idea. He said, "Finish the camp first." The camp was finished. Then they attacked. Inside the completed perimeter, the internal organization was just as precise as the outer defenses. The space was divided into clearly defined zones. The command area, the artillery positions if the legion carried them, the storage areas for supplies, the animal lines where the mules and horses were tethered, the workshop area where smiths and craftsmen could repair equipment, and the barracks rows where the tent lines were laid out in strict formation. Each contubernium, the 8-man tent group that was the smallest organizational unit of the legion, set up in its assigned position within its sentries area, which was itself within its cohorts area, which was itself within the clearly defined section of the camp for that legion or unit. There was no ambiguity, no argument about who slept where, no wasted time figuring out the plan. The tent itself was a structure of remarkable practicality and considerable discomfort. Made from strips of leather sewn together, usually goatskin or calfskin, based on accounts from the period, and leather fragments found at sites like Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall in northern England, the tent measured roughly 3 meters wide and perhaps 1.5 meters high at the center. 8 men were supposed to sleep inside it, sometimes 10, if 2 support servants or slaves who assisted each contubernium were included, though the official unit count was 8 fighting men. Given that an average soldier was around 1.67 meters tall, and that the sleeping space for each man has been calculated by researchers at roughly 56 centimeters wide, and the soldier's own body length, the interior of the tent was not spacious. It was a space about the size of a large bathroom, occupied by 8 sweating, exhausted men with their weapons, cloaks, and personal gear. The mule assigned to each contubernium carried the tent poles, the folded tent, the stakes, the ropes, 2 baskets used for the ditch digging work, the digging tools, a small stone hand mill for grinding grain, and additional food supplies. This single animal was, in a very literal sense, the portable home of 8 soldiers. Everything they needed to set up their sleeping space and prepare their food travelled on its back. In the evening, after the defences were built and before sleep was possible, the fire had to be lit, the grain had to be ground, and the food had to be prepared. The contubernium cooked together. Each group carried its own mill, ground its own wheat, made its own bread or porridge. The standard drink was posca, a mixture of water and vinegar that sounds unpleasant but was both hydrating and safer than drinking untreated water in unfamiliar territory. The main food was grain, supplemented by whatever the army's supply chain could provide or local foraging could find. Smoked pork, dried beans, cheese, olive oil, salt, and the fish sauce called garum were all documented parts of the military ration. Being issued barley instead of wheat was a punishment, a deliberate humiliation that signaled to the whole camp that a unit had failed in some way. Now consider the full sequence of a single day on campaign. The army woke before dawn and dismantled the previous night's camp. It marched 25 kilometers. It arrived at the new site, often in the early to mid-afternoon if the pace was good, and immediately began 3 to 6 hours of physical construction. After the construction was complete, the men ground their grain, cooked their food, performed their equipment maintenance, stood their assigned guard watches, and then finally lay down to sleep in a leather tent with 7 other men. The sleeping space was so small that they essentially spooned together in rows, surrounded by the smell of leather, sweat, smoke, wet wool, and old food. No mattress. Their army cloak served as both blanket and bedding, weapons within arm's reach, boots close by, armor either worn or staged nearby, depending on the threat level. In my view, battles are often decided before the first weapon is raised, because preparation quietly builds the victory that later looks sudden. What the Romans were doing with all of this was not simply solving the problem of where to sleep. They were solving the problem of how to project sustained military power across enormous distances for extended periods of time, in hostile territory, without losing their army to the night. Every shovelful of dirt in that ditch was an investment. Every planted stake was insurance. Every organized watch rotation was a hedge against the worst possible outcome. And the worst possible outcome, for a Roman army caught unprepared in the dark, was not just a military defeat, it was annihilation. History recorded those moments too, and we will come to them. But first, the night itself. Phase 1. The first night in enemy territory. Fear. The first night in genuinely hostile territory was different from all the others. Every soldier knew it. The centurions knew it. The tribunes on the rampart knew it. This was not a familiar march through a pacified province where the locals had made peace with Roman rule. This was the other side of the frontier. The ground here had never known a Roman plough. The forest beyond the ditch belonged to people who had no intention of accepting Roman authority and who had been watching the column advance for days. By the time the last stake was driven and the last gate was closed, darkness had come fully down. Inside the camp, the fires burned low, kept small deliberately, because a large fire at night was a beacon. The men in the tents could hear things. Wind in trees that had no names in Latin. Sounds that might have been animals and might have been something else. Young soldiers from the cities of Italy or Spain lay still in the dark and tried to remember that the ditch was out there, that the wall was out there, that someone was standing watch on the rampart above them. But the sound that no one wanted to hear and that everyone was listening for was the sound of the watchword challenge being answered wrong. The Roman camp at night ran on a system of rotating guards and a nightly password. Every evening, the password for the night was distributed through the camp on small wooden or lead tokens called tesserae, which passed from unit to unit through the chain of command. Sentries at key positions challenged anyone who approached in the dark, and the response had to be the correct watchword for that specific night. If you did not know the word, if you hesitated, if you gave the wrong answer, things happened very quickly, and they were not good. 4 watches divided the night. The first ran roughly from sunset to the 3rd hour of darkness. The second ran through midnight. The third covered the deepest cold of early morning, that brutal stretch between midnight and 3 hours before dawn that soldiers in every army, across every century, have always considered the worst of all. The 4th watch carried through to first light. Each watch had its assigned sentries, and those sentries were checked by an officer making rounds with the tokens. A quarter of the legion's strength was on watch at any given moment in the night. That meant that if a camp held 5,000 men, over 1,000 of them were awake and armed at all times, while the rest slept. The tents were never all sleeping. The camp was never truly still. On this first night, the attack came before the 3rd watch ended. Not a full assault, a probe. A few hundred fighters moving out of the tree line toward the eastern face of the camp, quiet and fast, looking for a soft spot, a sleepy sentry, a section of palisade that had been planted carelessly. They had done this before to other armies. Sometimes it worked. It did not work tonight. The sentries on the eastern rampart saw movement in the darkness before the attackers reached the ditch. The alarm call went up, sharp and specific, the signal that told every man in the camp exactly which section of the perimeter needed reinforcement and in what strength. What happened next is something that still impresses military historians who study the Roman system carefully. Men who had been asleep for less than 2 hours came out of their tents in fighting order, not stumbling and confused, reaching in the dark for weapons they could not find. They knew where their weapons were because they had placed them within arm's reach before lying down. They knew where to go because they had practiced this, and because the camp had a fixed layout, and every man knew his assigned position in an alarm. But here is the part that the attackers outside the ditch had not fully reckoned with. The ditch itself was 2 meters deep and 3 meters wide. Beyond it, in the dark, men with javelins had the high ground of the rampart. The attackers who made it to the edge of the ditch found themselves at the bottom of a killing zone with no cover, no way forward that did not require climbing down and then up again in the dark under a shower of peeler, and no element of surprise left at all. The probe collapsed. The attackers withdrew back to the tree line. Inside the camp, the alarm stood down. The damaged sentries were replaced. The third watch finished its rotation. The fourth watch began, and most of the 5,000 men went back to sleep. Comment below and write the word Legion if you think this kind of system is the most underrated military advantage in the ancient world. Phase 2. The 10th night. When the system is tested by something worse than swords. 10 nights into the campaign, the enemy that was hurting the Roman army most was not the one outside the ditch. It was the rain. It had been raining for 4 days without stopping. Not the soft rain of an Italian spring, but the cold, relentless, determined rain of the northern highlands, the kind that found every gap in the leather stitching, every fold in a cloak, every spot where the ground had been disturbed by digging and turned itself into mud. The tent of each contubernium was waterproof in the way that a leaf is waterproof. It kept off the worst of it. But by the 10th night, the interior of every tent smelled like a wet animal and felt like one too. 8 men in a 3-meter square of wet leather, with water running under the tent floor where the drainage had not been cut properly, sharing heat that was the only warmth available. Some of the men had been sick for 3 days. One had a wound on his calf from a skirmish 2 days earlier that the unit medic had cleaned and bandaged, but that ached badly in the cold. Another had developed sores on his feet from 14 hours a day in wet boots. This is the reality of campaign life that the stone reliefs on Trajan's column do not show you. The columns show clean formations, heroic postures, orderly siege works. They do not show the smell of 8 men in a tent after 10 days of rain. They do not show the hand that reaches in the dark for a water skin and finds it empty. They do not show the centurion standing outside in the downpour at midnight, making sure his centuries section of the palisade was still solid, because that was his job, and he had been doing it for 20 years, and he would do it for as many more as he lived. On this particular night, a foraging party had not returned. 6 men from one of the sentries had gone out that afternoon to gather firewood and see if they could locate a grain store in the abandoned farm buildings 2 kilometers to the north. They had not come back before the gates closed at dusk. They were not going to come back. Everyone in their tent knew it by the 2nd hour of the night. The 7th man, the one who had been left behind on camp duties that day, lay in the space normally occupied by the 6 absent ones, and did not sleep. He could hear, in the tent next to his, the grinding of someone's hand mill in the dark, the slow, circular rhythm of grain against stone that was the most domestic sound in the entire military world. Someone preparing tomorrow's rations. Someone doing the thing that needed to be done regardless of what had happened to 6 men in the forest. But the system did not pause for grief, and, in its strange way, that was a mercy. The system did not allow a man to spend his whole night inside his own fear. There was too much to do. The watch rotation pulled him up and put him on the rampart. The cold focused him. The password exchange with the officer making rounds reminded him that there were 1,000 other men awake in the same darkness, with the same cold and the same uncertainty. Here is what most people miss when they look at the contubernium, the 8-man tent group, and see it as just an administrative unit. It was not an administrative unit. It was a survival structure. 8 men who marched together, ate together, slept together, worked together, and watched each other's backs in the dark were not just colleagues. They were the smallest possible team that could function on all the tasks that kept a soldier alive on campaign. When one man was sick, another could grind his grain. When one was on watch, another kept his equipment dry. When one did not come back, the other 7 kept going, because that was the only available option, and because the system had given them enough shared routine and shared identity that they could carry it. This is where the Roman system showed its real genius. It did not depend on any one man being exceptional. It depended on a structure that made ordinary men capable of extraordinary endurance, not through inspiration, but through habit. The same tent, the same position, the same rotation, night after night, until it was as natural as breathing. Phase 3. The 30th night. The mistake. By the 30th night of the campaign, some of the initial fear had settled into something more dangerous than fear. It had settled into familiarity. Familiarity was the enemy's best ally. The centurion in charge of the 3rd century of the 2nd cohort was a man who had been on campaign for 11 years. He had served in Syria, in North Africa, and now in this grey northern forest. And in 11 years he had seen the same enemy tactics enough times to believe he understood them. The camp's position that night was on a bend in a river, with the water protecting 2 full sides of the perimeter. The ground was clear and flat. The nearest tree line was 400 meters away. He made a decision. The ditch on the riverside of the camp, he ordered, would be dug to half depth. The men were exhausted. The position was naturally protected. There was no evidence of enemy activity within several kilometers. Half depth was enough. By the standards of 11 years of experience, this was a reasonable judgment. By the standards of Roman military doctrine, it was a violation that had a very specific name, and that name was negligence. 3 hours before dawn, on the 3rd watch, a force of 300 attackers crossed the river upstream, moved quietly along the bank in the dark, and came in from the riverside of the camp exactly where the ditch was half depth and the rampart was correspondingly lower. The sentry saw them. The alarm went up in time. No section of the camp was actually breached, but in the scramble to reinforce the riverside of the perimeter, 2 men fell from the rampart in the dark, and one of them broke his arm. A gate was briefly opened to allow a countercharge that should not have been necessary. For approximately 12 minutes, the defensive coherence of that section of the camp was something less than what it should have been, and everyone in the camp felt it the same way a ship feels it when a seam opens slightly in heavy weather. Nothing sank, but everyone knew something had shifted. The centurion was brought before a military tribunal the next morning. The proceedings were not long. The facts were not in dispute. He was demoted. He was fined. He was required to stand in front of his century, stripped of certain insignia, while the full charge was read aloud. But here is the part that changed everything. Or rather, the part that made sure nothing changed. That evening, the 4th century's centurion, a younger man who had observed all of this, oversaw the digging of a ditch on a completely flat, completely secure section of ground to a depth half a meter greater than regulations required. He did not explain why. He did not make a speech about lessons learned. He simply watched his men dig deeper than they had to, and he did not call them back until it was done. This is how institutional knowledge moves through a military organization, not through lectures, through consequences that are public, immediate, and visible to everyone who will ever command a century after this man. Phase 4. The long night. The system at maximum pressure. Hours before dawn, on a night without stars, the real attack came. Not a probe, not a raid. A coordinated assault on three sides of the camp simultaneously planned to overwhelm the watch rotation by forcing the defenders to split their attention and their response. The force outside numbered, by later estimates that ancient sources debate and modern historians do not fully accept, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 fighters. They had moved through the forest at night, without fires, maintaining silence over a march of several kilometers, which was itself a significant tactical achievement and suggested planning and coordination that went beyond the usual raid. The attack on all three sides was meant to arrive at the same moment. It did not quite manage that. The western probe arrived perhaps 3 minutes before the northern and eastern ones, and those 3 minutes made a difference. Because the watch on the western rampart had the alarm signal out before the other two assaults reached the ditch, what happened next happened fast. The trumpet signal that woke the camp was specific. It told every man not just that there was an attack, but which sections of the perimeter were under pressure. Men came out of their tents armed, not because they had jumped up in panic, but because the camp's design meant that every tent was within 60 meters of a point on the perimeter wall, and every man had an assigned alarm position that he had walked to in daylight and could walk to in the dark. The weapons that had been laid within arm's reach before lying down were exactly where they had been left. The first cohort, which was the most experienced unit and always positioned closest to the command center, moved to reinforce the western gate where the initial probe was testing for a breakthrough. The third and sixth cohorts took the northern and eastern walls. Artillery, ballistae, and lighter bolt shooters assigned to the Legion had been positioned before nightfall in the locations where they would provide maximum coverage of the approaches to the gates. But here is what most people forget when they imagine this scene. A quarter of the Legion was already awake. Before the first alarm sounded, over 1,200 men were on watch, on the rampart, or on standby in their assigned positions around the camp. They were not woken by the alarm. They were already there, already cold, already watching. When the attackers outside the ditch looked at the wall above them and saw torchlight moving, they were not seeing panicking soldiers fumbling for their weapons. They were seeing the Night Watch doing exactly what the Night Watch had been doing for the last 3 hours, already organized, already in position, already counting the shadows in the dark beyond the ditch. The assault on the northern face came closest to something dangerous. A section of the palisade there had been weakened 3 days earlier by a tree that had fallen against it in a storm, and the repair had been partial. The attackers found it, which suggested they had scouted more carefully than anyone had anticipated. And for approximately 20 minutes there was genuine close-quarters fighting at the base of the wall on that section. Comment below and write the word "yes" if you think you would have been terrified standing in that darkness, on that wall, with attackers coming from the tree line. The centurion commanding that section of wall was a 34-year-old man from the town of Lugdunum, which we call Lyon today, in what is now France. His name has not survived. We do not know what he looked like or what he thought in those 20 minutes. What we know is that his sentry held the section. What we know is that when the morning came, the wall was still standing and the men on it were still alive. By dawn, the attack had collapsed on all three sides. The coordination that had made it dangerous had also made it brittle. When the western probe failed to breach the gate in the first few minutes, the momentum of the entire assault began to drain away. Attackers without clear success on any wall, facing organized defenders who had the height advantage, the weapons advantage, and the advantage of knowing exactly where to stand, faced a calculation that most humans in that situation make the same way. The cost of continuing was rising. The chance of success was falling. They withdrew. Inside the camp, as the light came up, the watch handed off to the day rotation. Fires were built up. Grain was ground. The smell of baking bread moved across the camp in the cold morning air. Sentries on the rampart watched the tree line with the particular vigilance of men who have just survived something and are not yet willing to assume it is over. The bodies outside the northern section of the wall were counted later. The numbers in the ancient sources that describe similar engagements vary enough that modern historians treat any specific figure with caution, so I will not invent one for this account. What the defenders found, in the grey morning light, was evidence of what a well-built ditch and a well-placed wall do to an attack that cannot breach them. The camp was still standing. It was always going to be still standing. Phase 5. The final count. The price of the system. After 8 months in the field, the numbers told a story that the official dispatches would summarize in 2 lines and move past without pausing. A single legion in a full campaign season built somewhere between 150 and 200 marching camps. The exact count varied by route, terrain, and the pace of operations, and no single ancient source gives a comprehensive accounting for a specific campaign. So the figures historians work with are estimates based on campaign distances and marching rates. But even the conservative estimates describe a quantity of physical labor that is difficult to fully grasp. Each camp required a perimeter ditch of several hundred meters, dug to a depth of roughly 2 meters. If you run the calculation across 200 camps, you arrive at a volume of earth moved by hand tools over 8 months, that is, by any reasonable measure, staggering. Not counting the rampart, not counting the palisade stakes, not counting the internal construction, the road maintenance, the bridge building, the siege works, and all the other engineering tasks that Roman legionaries performed as a routine part of military service when they were not actually fighting. The men who did this were not giants. They were not superhuman. They were human beings between the ages of roughly 17 and 45, drawn from every province of the empire, speaking different languages and worshipping different gods, and coming from farms and cities and fishing villages. Many of them were barely past adolescence when they signed the oath of enlistment. What they shared was not heroic destiny. It was training and repetition, and a system that had been refined over generations to convert ordinary physical labor into military advantage. The cost was real. Ancient sources do not give us reliable casualty figures for individual campaigns broken down by corps, and modern historians debate how to interpret the numbers that do survive. But disease killed more soldiers on campaign than combat in most ancient military contexts, and the physical toll of 8 months of hard marching, digging, and fighting was not something a human body absorbed without consequence. The men who completed a full campaign were not the same men who had started it. Their hands were different. Their sleep was different. The way they moved and the way they looked at open ground at night were different. Some did not complete it. The young soldier from the province of Hispania, 19 years old when the campaign began, was 20 when it ended. His hands no longer looked 19. The tremor that had been there the first time he gripped a shovel in genuinely hostile Njorda was gone. He had ground his grain and eaten his posca, and slept in the press of 7 other men, and stood his watches, and done all of it again the next day, and the day after that, until doing it stopped requiring courage and started requiring only habit. That transition from courage to habit is what the Roman system was designed to produce, and this is why the story still matters today. Not because the Roman army is a model for modern military organizations in any direct tactical sense, though military historians have noted the parallels more than once. It matters because the system demonstrated, across centuries of continuous operation in some of the most challenging military environments the ancient world offered, that the ordinary made relentless is a form of power that exceptional moments of bravery cannot reliably replace. The ditch that was dug when no attack was expected. The watch that was kept when nothing stirred in the dark. The camp that was built even when the men were exhausted, even when the ground was frozen, even when the enemy was nowhere in sight. Especially then. The morning the last camp of the season was struck, it looked the same as every other morning. The trumpet signal at first light, the sound of stakes being pulled from the earth with that particular hollow thud that 8 months of repetition had made as familiar as a heartbeat. Tents folded, rolled, loaded onto the mule. Ditch partially filled in or left open if the engineers deemed it useful to a future passage. Palisade stakes bundled and added to the load if they were still serviceable, or burned where they stood if they were not. In less than 2 hours, there was nothing. Where the camp had stood, there was a rectangle of compacted earth, slightly lower around the perimeter where the ditch had been, slightly higher where the rampart had stood. The interior was flat and bare, packed hard by thousands of feet over weeks. Ash from the fire pits, a few iron nails and fragments of leather strap that the soldiers had not bothered to retrieve, the short-cropped grass around the outer edge where the horses and mules had grazed. By midday, the forest beyond the rectangle looked the same as it had before the camp existed. The birds had come back into the trees. The stream nearby ran at its usual level. If you did not know what you were looking at, you might walk past the rectangle in the earth and notice nothing. But the rectangle stayed. Historians of the Roman military are careful about casualty figures because the ancient sources that survive are inconsistent, sometimes wildly so, and because the tendency of ancient writers to round numbers or select figures for rhetorical effect makes precision impossible. What can be said with confidence is that a Roman campaign of 8 months in contested territory was not a clean or bloodless operation. Combat casualties were one part of the equation. Disease was another, and in most ancient military contexts, a larger one. The physical attrition of sustained campaign marching was a third. Men fell to infections, to injuries that seemed minor and proved fatal weeks later, to fevers from contaminated water, to cold and exposure when the season turned. The exact numbers for any specific campaign are uncertain, and I will not offer invented figures in their place. What the archaeological and documentary record does support is that a full legion entering a long campaign and a full legion exiting it were not the same institution in human terms, even if the unit designations remained the same on the rolls. The centurion who had ordered the shallow ditch returned from the campaign without his century command. He had been assigned to administrative duties for the remainder of the deployment, a posting that was, in the culture of the Roman military, a form of public professional death. He was not the first officer in Roman history to pay that kind of price for the wrong economy of effort on the wrong night. He would not be the last. The commanders who had run the campaign emerged with their reputations intact or enhanced, which was the more common outcome when a campaign achieved its objectives and brought the army home in recognizable fighting condition. The dispatches sent to Rome described victories, territories secured, enemies pacified or destroyed, and the usual metrics by which Roman military success was measured and communicated to the Senate and the public. What the dispatches did not describe in any detail was the 200 rectangles in the earth that stretched back through the landscape of the campaign route like a dotted line drawn by an exhausted hand. The nights, the watch rotations, the grain ground at midnight, the stakes driven in the rain, the 8 men in the tent and the one who did not come back. Those things were assumed. They were the invisible machinery of every Roman military success, so routine that writing them down would have seemed, to the Roman officer composing the dispatch, like a carpenter explaining that he had used a hammer. Where the final camp had stood, the earth remembered the shape of it long after the men had gone. Rain would soften the edges of the ditch over the following seasons. Vegetation would reclaim the interior. By the time a generation had passed, the rectangle would be barely visible at ground level, but from the air it would remain. The marching camp of the Roman legion was not designed to become a city. It was designed to be forgotten by morning. And yet, across the former territory of the Roman Empire, from the moors of northern Scotland to the sands of the Jordanian desert, thousands of these temporary overnight positions have left marks on the earth that 2,000 years of weather, farming, and construction have not fully erased. From aircraft, in the right light, at the right angle, the squared outlines of Roman marching camps appear in fields and hillsides as crop marks, places where the disturbed and refilled soil of an ancient ditch causes the grain above it to grow at a slightly different rate than the undisturbed ground around it. Archaeologists have mapped hundreds of these sites. There are certainly more that have not yet been identified. Each one represents a single night, one night in which a Roman army stopped moving, built its fort, slept inside it, and then vanished with the sunrise. Multiply that single night by centuries of continuous Roman military operations across a territory that at its height covered 5 million square kilometers, and the scale of the system becomes something close to incomprehensible. Not a battle, not a campaign. A system of behavior, enforced and repeated so many times that it inscribed itself permanently into the landscape of a continent. But the most visible legacy of the Roman camp is not in the fields, it is in the cities. York in England began as the fortress of Eboracum, the permanent base of the 9th and then the 6th Legion. Cologne in Germany takes its name from Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, a Roman colonial settlement that grew up around a military installation. Vienna was Vindobona, the camp of the 14th Legion on the Danube frontier. The street layouts of these cities, even today, still carry traces of the Roman grid, the Via Principalis and the Via Praetoria of the original camp, preserved in the angles of streets and the positions of medieval buildings that were built on Roman foundations, because the foundations were already there and already good. The camp did not just protect the army that built it, it planted a seed. The men who built the ditch and drove the stakes were not thinking about the cities that would grow up around their overnight position. They were thinking about surviving the night. But the disciplined repetition of their work, night after night, left infrastructure that outlasted everything else. For the practice of war, the Romans demonstrated something that military theorists have spent centuries trying to articulate. An army is not its weapons. An army is not its commanders, though commanders matter. An army is its habits, the things it does without being told, the reflexes it has built through training and repetition until they operate below the level of conscious decision. The Roman soldier who dug his section of the ditch on a quiet night in a secured province was not doing it because he was afraid. He was doing it because the alternative, the version of himself that skipped the ditch and got used to skipping it, was a worse soldier, in a worse army, that would fail at the moment when the quiet province stopped being quiet. The secret was never the sword. It was never the shield. It was never the road, though the road was extraordinary. It was never the eagle standard, or the formation, or the pilum, or the genius of any single general, though all of these played their parts. The secret was that they did the same thing, the right way, every night, regardless of how tired they were, regardless of whether anyone was watching, regardless of whether the ground outside looked safe or dangerous. They built the ditch because the ditch was part of what they were. They kept the watch because the watch was not optional. They slept in the press of 7 other men with their weapons within arm's reach because that was how it was done, and how it had always been done, and how it would be done tomorrow. Discipline is not the absence of freedom. Discipline is the price paid in advance, quietly and without ceremony, for the freedom to survive what is coming. Centuries later, the forests where the Roman sentries stood their watches are silent. The men are long gone. Their tents have dissolved. Their mules are bones in foreign soil. The languages they spoke to each other in the dark, Latin mixed with Gaulish and Spanish and Thracian and a dozen other tongues, are dead or transformed beyond recognition. But from 30,000 feet above the fields of northern England, Scotland, Romania, and Syria, the earth still holds the shape of where they slept. They did not build an empire by being braver than their enemies. They built it by sleeping smarter. If this video helped you see this piece of history more clearly, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who enjoy history told this way. And if you want more stories about how empires were built and lost, about the battles and the systems and the decisions that shaped the world we live in, subscribe so you are here for the next one. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video.